let's talk about souls. Now, a lot of people think they have a soul, but it's been my experience that if you ask this person what exactly a soul is, they can't really tell you. So we're going to look at the idea as it has been defended in philosophy and the various sort of criticisms of the idea and the problems with the idea, the reasons why you might argue for it and the reasons why you might not. This is sort of a precursor to getting more into a topic that is called personal identity, and we'll talk more about that next time. But for now, let's look at the idea that we have souls. Now, probably the earliest main proponent of this idea is the very famous ancient Greek philosopher Plato. And Plato argued that we had souls that had some features that make them attractive, and some features that maybe you hadn't really thought about. So, for example, Plato argued that our soul is immortal, indestructible, cannot be destroyed. And he also argued that your soul pre-exists your body. So, in other words, your soul had been around before your body even came into existence. That idea is usually associated with notions of reincarnation. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to it. But so Plato is perhaps the most influential propagator of the idea that we have souls. And in fact, Plato, it's generally considered, has been enormously influential on Christian thinkers and might be responsible for the idea that we have a soul being incorporated into Christian thought. Because actually, it's not necessarily entirely compatible with a lot of the things that are said in the Bible. I know some translations of the Bible do talk about souls, but remember these are translations, and they have to decide how to translate an ancient word that might not have an easy equivalent in modern language, and they might have just picked soul. But, for example, a book of the Bible called Ecclesiastes, if you read that, there's no mention that we have souls, and in fact it suggests that we go to dust. It's rather as some Christian writer has said of it, it reads kind of like modern existentialist writing, and it's a book included in the Bible. It has very famous words in it that were turned into a song by the Byrds. Turn, turn, turn. But anyway, Ecclesiastes seems to suggest that when we die, we're just worm food. So that's one part of the Bible. And there's also a famous Christian idea that when we die, we turn to dust and we cease to exist until the day of judgment. And on the day of judgment, we are recreated and God judges us and, decides our eternal fate. So on this view, which is supposed to be official Christian doctrine, nobody is in heaven or hell yet. Everybody who's ever died is just dead and not currently existing, and they'll only re-exist when the day of judgment comes, which hasn't come yet, obviously. This isn't entirely consistent with some suggestions also in the Bible, because newsflash, the Bible isn't fully consistent. For example, there's a suggestion in the Bible called the harrowing of hell, where Jesus is supposed to have gone down to hell and in the 3 days before he was resurrected and rescued some people from hell, essentially. So that suggests that there were people in hell. So it's kind of a mixed bag. It's open to many different interpretations. All right. Now, the modern writer who has done most to defend the idea of something like a soul is René Descartes, who is regarded as the father of modern philosophy, which was sort of philosophy had this amazing rebirth in the Renaissance, and Descartes was writing in the 15 and 1600s. Well, he was born in the 1500s, writing in the 1600s. And Descartes famously argued for dualism. Dualism is the term dual, of course, means two, and dualism is the idea that there are two kinds of substance. Technically speaking, there are three because Descartes counts God as a substance, but there are two kinds of created substance. When God created the universe, Descartes was a Christian, he had to create two completely different kinds of stuff. One is matter. That's the stuff that we're familiar with, that you can stub your toe on, that my body is made of. That this is made of matter. It's made of atoms. Descartes uses the term body and matter kind of interchangeably. So he can talk about body and mean just a rock or something like that. It doesn't necessarily just mean flesh. But certainly my body is also made of matter. It's made of atoms. And Descartes, as who was, besides being a philosopher, was also a great mathematician, was very much interested in matter. He invented the idea of coordinates, which is a way of locating any chunk of matter. Because Descartes said an essential feature of matter is that it has a location. So any piece of matter has a place that it exists in. Now, Descartes also had the idea that when you had two completely different kinds of stuff or substances, they cannot share any properties. So because matter always has a location, he says that mind, which we're going to think of as equivalent to soul, doesn't have a location. So that means, he said, of course, that each human consists of both a body and a soul. In fact, of these two, he would probably side more with number two. Well, maybe at different stages in your existence, but certainly in your time on Earth, you are both your body and your mind or soul. It's just that you can lose your body and still exist. Kind of like, for example, there are physicalist thinkers who don't believe that we have a soul, and they say that essentially what's important about you is your brain, and in theory, you could lose the entire rest of your body and still exist as an individual if your brain was still working. I don't know if anybody watched the TV show Futurama, but they kept having famous people from the 20th century show up as floating heads in vats, and they were still able to communicate because they kept their brains alive. So that view suggests that you are your entire body, but only your head is essential. Whereas Descartes' view is, I am this mixture of mind and body, but only the mind is essential. Now, so when we describe what souls are like, we're typically influenced by Descartes' view. Because Plato says some things about the soul, for example, that it's immortal, and also in his masterpiece, The Republic, he gives a kind of psychological breakdown of the soul, saying that it has different parts that pull against each other, which sounds a lot like Freudian psychology. You know, the Freudian idea that you have the id, the conscious, and the subconscious. The subconscious is the id. The subconscious, the conscious, and the superego. That idea that there are different parts of me that aren't necessarily aware of the other parts, Something like that exists in Plato. We are pulled in three different directions, according to Plato, because we have three different parts of our soul. So Plato has kind of an idiosyncratic view of the soul that he wouldn't necessarily agree with a lot of the things that Descartes says and vice versa. But they both have this idea that there is this thing that is not our body that is part of us. And it is immaterial. So our body is made of matter, so the soul isn't. And I think that's what most people, when they talk about the soul, have in mind. Now, not everybody, when they talk about the soul, has the same view as Descartes, that it is the same as my mind. I think people are kind of vague about this. Talking of Matt Groening animated shows, The Simpsons, there's a great episode of The Simpsons where Bart sells his soul because he doesn't believe that he has one, and so it's free money. But then he regrets it and has to buy it back. That idea that he has somehow lost his soul, he is able to walk about and talk, but it just as if there's an emptiness inside. That idea of soul, or famously, whenever people are supposed to make deals with the devil, they sell their soul. I don't know if they hang on to their soul for the time being. I don't know how the story works. The blues man Robert Johnson is supposed to have made a deal with the devil at the crossroads, which is why he suddenly became a great guitar player. I don't know if he sold his soul right then and there, or if it was just he had to go to hell after he died. I don't know how it works, and I don't think most people are particularly clear. But when philosophers talk about souls, they mean it interchangeably with the mind, with what you think with. So right now, what's having experiences, if you're looking at your laptop screen or you're looking at a computer screen, you're having experiences. The thing that the experiences are happening within is your mind, and they are mental events. That's the typical philosophy idea. Now, whether or not that mind is immaterial, as Descartes thought, or is actually just a feature of your body, as, for example, the guy that you're reading for this section, Shelley Kagan, and an awful lot of contemporary philosophers believe that your mind is just a feature of a physical object, your brain. That's open to question. But certainly everybody agrees that there are mental events, and your experience is a mental event. And if you believe in soul, it relies on your soul. Back to Descartes again. Descartes says because we are both, he's a dualist, so we are both mind and body, there has to be some form of interaction between your mind and your body. Now, not everybody believes this. Around the time Descartes was writing, and for a couple of hundred years afterwards, there was a big debate about whether or not really your mind and your soul could. Descartes thought they could interact just as physical objects interact. So, the philosophers always use the example of billiard balls, so I'm going to continue the tradition. Billiard balls interact. One ball rolls into another and the other one goes away. They can cause, there is causal interaction. One can cause the other to move. The same kind of causal interaction happens between mind and body, according to Descartes. So my mind has an idea, it says raise your arm, and this physical object, this chunk of atoms, goes up. So my mind, this immaterial thing, according to Descartes, can have an effect on a material thing. That's called interaction. They interact. Now, we're familiar with this, of course, and of course it works the other way. You can do something to a physical object and cause a mental event. So, for example, if I hammered a nail through my hand, this would cause pain, which is a mental event. So, it's a two-way street. But then the question is, and one of the puzzles that Descartes never really solved, and that led to alternative views that rejected interaction, is it's famously referred to as the mind-body problem. How is this supposed to work? And this is a big problem for Descartes, because Descartes says they have no features in common. Remember I said, he said that matter has a location, so your mind doesn't. So if you were to ask, where is my mind? Typically we point to our heads. Descartes would say, no, that's just a physical location, and your mind doesn't have a physical location. So where are my minds? Now, this means that presumably when I die, my minds don't have to go anywhere because they can't, they don't exist anywhere. So this doesn't really fit with the Christian idea of going to heaven, because that implies that heaven is some kind of location. So Descartes' view is kind of weird. Now, you can have a view like Descartes, but suggest that, okay, I'm going to reject that part that says that your mind doesn't have a location. Your mind does have a location, and it's like a little force ghost or whatever. My mind is this immaterial thing somewhere up here, and maybe spread throughout my body, because that explains how I can feel things. But then when I die, it lifts out. And certainly that seems to be the idea going on when people use supernatural events, like, and when we say supernatural, we don't just mean ghosts, although presumably when people talk about ghosts, they think that that's something to do with souls. What ghosts are disembodied souls that somehow have a shape. So again, not like Descartes' idea, because a shape is very much a physical feature. But these supernatural events, one of them is famously people who claim to have died under operations looked down on their bodies while they were being operated on. So that suggests that, usually your soul is sort of intermingled with your body. It's the same shape, but then when you die or something extreme happens to you, it can separate out and then you sort of float off somewhere. So people aren't very clear on exactly what souls are, but at least they seem to agree with this. They're not material because they can't be detected. Anything material we can basically put under a microscope. If you're made of atoms, we can see you, we can detect you, you take up space, you have mass or something like that. A soul doesn't. Although, isn't there that idea that when you die, you lose some tiny amount of weight? There was even a movie called that, something grams. And there is this idea that when death happens, you get this tiny amount of weight lighter. So this suggests that your soul does have a weight, which would make it material, because if you have a weight, that if it can be weighed, then it must be material. So I don't know what that would be about, but anyway, the idea. What's important about the idea of souls? Well, the idea of souls is important because, for one thing, it seems to allow for the possibility that you could survive the death of your body. Because if there's one thing we know about bodies, they decay. I mean, I can see it every day I look in the mirror. I'm decaying already, and it's only going to get worse until eventually this is worm food, or I think I want to be composted. There's that new green burial of where you're just they put your body in a big tumbler and they tumble you until you're good compost. That's the way to go. I don't want to be burned. That's wasteful of energy. And if you're given the normal kind of burial, they pump you full of chemicals which leach into the soil. So that's very bad for the earth. So eventually I'm going to be composted, or at least this is. Not for a while, I hope. So we know bad things happen to bodies. But if we want some kind of afterlife, if we want us to continue to exist after bad things have happened to this, then it must be the case that we are not this. And that's what dualism allows. It allows that maybe I have a body, but it's not me. Or if it is me, it's an inessential part of me. Yeah, so let's to distinguish these two ideas. If I am my soul, then my body is kind of like a set of clothes. It's just something that I put on. This is more like Plato's view. In fact, according to Plato, it's kind of a shock to the soul to be embodied, and the soul actually would rather be free, partly because when the soul is not embodied, it can directly observe the forms, which is a whole bunch of ideas that we can't really get into in such a short video. But yeah, according to Plato, my body is basically just like a suit of clothes. Alternatively, on this view, my body is like a leg. I obviously have a leg and it's part of me, but I can lose a leg and still be me. So that would be the idea that my body is part of me, but it's not an essential part. So maybe I'd miss it when I die, but often people think we can get a new body. Maybe up in heaven you get a perfect version of yourself. You get to pick the perfect age that you were, you get a bit of work done, you know, maybe you get a new body and you stroll around the heavenly streets or whatever it looks like, maybe like The Good Place, the TV show. Now, so the idea of the soul allows for this kind of afterlife, which of course we have no evidence for, at least no hard evidence. Lots of people claim there's evidence, you know. People claim that they've died and they've seen it. Although a famous recent case of a kid who supposedly died and saw heaven and became a huge star, and then he recanted everything. He said his dad basically made him say it, and it was all bullshit. So we've got no real evidence that there is an afterlife. But it's certainly something a lot of people wish was true. And if we were our souls, that seems to open the door to that. There are some other things that often people don't really talk about. So, for example, pre-existence. If my soul can exist separately from my body, stands to reason it existed before my body, because why would it come into existence with my body? How's that supposed to work? Seriously, if you believe that you are a soul and body, when did your soul join with your body? Now, some in the anti-abortion community, if there's a community, believe that happens at conception. You know, when the sperm meets the egg and you've got a microscopic fertilized egg or a zygote, that ensoulment happens then. That's not actually the view of traditional Christian writers. So, for example, the great Christian philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas said that ensoulment happens when the embryo takes on human form, and he thought that happened later in pregnancies. Although his view got combined with the earlier view because of somebody looked at a sperm under an early microscope and insisted that it looked like a little guy or a homunculus. So that led to the view that actually ensoulment, the sperm were already ensouled. Basically, if you believe that ensoulment happens at conception, what exactly is happening? Is a soul starting to exist then, or is a soul that already existed being joined with this body? Now, I've never understood why abortion is particularly bad if you believe in souls, because all that happens in abortion is presumably the soul is separated from that and gets to go on and, you know, continue to exist as before and maybe get a new body. No big deal. But still, there is a question of pre-existence. People who believe that they've had past lives, for example, seem to have this idea that they've got information in their souls from previous bodies that their souls have been in. Then, now even if you believe in souls, they don't have to last forever. So, for example, Plato's student, Aristotle, believed that we have souls, although he didn't think that they were souls like Plato thought. He thought that they just existed while our body existed, and they were essentially what gave our body its unity. And then when the body dissolved, they dissolved too. So they were very much mortal souls. I think that kind of undoes the motivation for believing in souls if you don't get to exist after the death of your body. And of course, if you believe in reincarnation, how would reincarnation be possible unless there was something that was you that wasn't the body? Because you obviously have a different body from the past life that you're supposed to have had. So there must be something that that you now and this person in the past had in common, and the suggestion is the soul. All right, so there's all kinds of reasons why you might be motivated to believe in a soul. But are they good reasons? That's what we're going to look into a little bit now. So, in the chapter by Shelley Kagan that I had you read, he talks about inference to the best explanation as a way to argue for souls. Because as he points out, we cannot detect souls in the normal way. So there's a reason I believe in okapis. Do you know what an okapi is? Look it up if you don't. But the thing about okapis is they managed to exist for essentially millions and millions of years, and we only just found out about them, I think in the 20th century. Humans first, or at least the West, probably some humans had found them before, but nobody really knew about them until the 20th century because they'd just been living quietly in the jungle. So, but I believe in okapis because somebody saw them. They've finally been seen. There's some in zoos. You can go and see one. You can't do that with a soul. Now, some people who believe in souls say, well, you're seeing with them all the time. That's what you see with. But of course, if you can offer an alternative explanation of how seeing is done that doesn't involve requiring this strange immaterial thing that can't be detected, then it seems like you've got a better theory. And in fact, that's the idea of inference to the best explanation. Inference to the best explanation says, we have a reason to believe in whatever the best explanation of the phenomena we can observe requires. So, for example, suppose I notice the following events in my house. I notice scratching. I hear scratching in the walls. I notice there are little holes, apparently bored in the wooden parts, what's that called, the wainscoting or something, at the bottoms of my walls. I notice when I leave cheese out overnight, there are tiny little bits missing from it during the day. And I also noticed that there's a lot of tiny little things that on examination turn out to be mouse shit scattered around my house. So these are a bunch of phenomena that I can observe. And I ask, what explains these phenomena? It seems the obvious explanation is that I have mice living in my house, even though, of course, I've never observed them, and perhaps I never will. But still, I have good reason to believe in their existence. Now, that's not the only possible explanation. There are other possible explanations. It could all be a massive conspiracy theory run by this sinister cabal of, cannibalistic politicians that come and for whatever reason they want to mess with my mind. They put recordings of scratching in my walls. They drill holes in my walls. They scatter mouse shit, probably infected with COVID or whatever. That's an alternative explanation. That does explain the phenomena. But the reason why it would be wrong for me to believe it is because there's a much better alternative explanation. So I should believe the best available explanation. Now, maybe a better one will come along later, and maybe further facts will undermine that. But for the facts that I have, the best explanation is believing in the mice, even though, of course, I haven't observed them. And that's why we believe in things like atoms, X-rays, and planets. Planets, for example, the planet, well, is it a planet? But anyway, Pluto the existence of Pluto was postulated before it was actually observed, because of strange anomalies in the orbits of other bodies. And they said, well, this shouldn't happen unless there's something that's there having a gravitational pull on these planets. Otherwise, we don't understand why they're moving so weirdly. So this enabled people to say, well, the perfect explanation of this phenomenon that we're observing of strange orbits would be if there were a planet just there. That would explain it. And then they trained their telescopes on it, and what do you know? There was a planet there. So this was the perfect instance of inference to the best explanation. The best explanation of the observed phenomenon, which was the strange orbit, was the existence of something there. Another example, dark matter. Apparently, most of the universe is composed of this stuff called dark matter, which is not like the soul because it's not immaterial, because the reason why we think it exists is because it has this effect on the stuff that we can observe. So the atoms and stuff that we observe is actually a tiny fraction of the universe, according to the current theories. And it must be, because otherwise our theories don't work. And the best explanation that would make our theories work is the existence of this stuff called dark matter, which we cannot observe. So that's a perfect example of best explanation. Scientists believe in this stuff that we cannot observe, because otherwise it's a mystery why the stuff that we do observe is doing what it does. All right, can we give an argument like that proves the existence of a soul? Is there something that we do observe that can only be explained, or that can be best explained by the existence of a soul? And people who believe in the souls have offered various candidates. So, for example, the very early idea of the soul that actually predates Plato's discussion of it, the ancient Greek idea of the soul is it explains life. So the Latin that gets translated as soul is anima, and anima is the root of animation, or animate, as in bring to life. So there's always been this connection between the idea of a soul and the idea of life. So, for example, the ancient Plato Greeks said that everything alive has a soul. Now, does this fit with our modern ideas? Well, first of all, no, because they thought that plants had souls, because after all, plants are alive. They do the things that living things do. They take in energy, they grow, and so on. So all plants have life too. So you are destroying or you are liberating a soul when you forget to water your plant. We don't believe that now, and certainly Descartes certainly didn't think that, because he didn't even believe that non-human animals had souls, which actually was a view that led to horrible mistreatment of animals, thanks to Descartes' view. Descartes actually believed that animals were like little robots. They were just the bodies without the souls, because they weren't capable of rational thought. So they didn't experience in the way that we do, because feeling, according to Descartes, depended on a soul. So no animal felt pain, and therefore if you cut them open while they were alive, sure, they'll wriggle around a bit, but they're not feeling anything. This was Descartes' view, and it led to horrible, horrible mistreatment of animals, just because of this theoretical idea that they didn't have a soul. So his view was very different from this ancient Greek idea. Do we think that like an amoeba has a soul? I don't think you'll find many people who believe that. That we just think that plants and microcelled organisms don't have souls, but they are alive. So nowadays we have a physicalist, that is non-dualist, explanation of what it is to live. It's just very complicated arrangement of atoms and proteins and so on. When you arrange atoms in a certain way, you get a living thing. It's very complicated. It involves DNA and all these things, but it's it is just physical, just as your iPhone is a very complicated physical object. It's not like just a slab. You can get a thing that is the same size and shape as an iPhone and is made of slate, and that is a simple physical object that won't do what your iPhone does. So life processes are just very complicated arrangements of physical things. So life was an original reason for believing in souls, but we don't believe that anymore. Why? Because we think there's a better explanation in terms of matter. And the reason why a physicalist explanation of any of these things is always going to be better, if it's possible, than an immaterial one is because it enables us to study it. We can see matter. We can manipulate matter. We can bombard matter with, magnetism or whatever. We can experiment with matter. Whereas souls, they're totally undetectable. So if you're saying that, oh, it's explained by souls, it's very little different from saying, oh, it's magic. Magic, of course, can't be explained. But if you're a scientist, you want to be able to explain something. So any explanation that enables you to test your explanation and say, well, if it's true, then this follows, that's a scientific explanation. And you can't do that with anything that involves the soul. Thinking. All right. Yes, this was, in fact, Descartes. If Descartes is famous for anything besides dualism and inventing Cartesian coordinates, it's his saying, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum in the Latin, although probably not pronounced like that. His idea there is that what I am is a thinking thing. That so I am essentially a thinking thing. I can lose my body and still be me, but I cannot, so long as, if I stop thinking, then I stop existing. So on his view, the soul is a thinking thing, and it can't be my body because I can imagine existing without a body. Now, but what physicalists who don't believe in immaterial stuff, they just believe in matter, would say is, no, again, thinking can be explained with material. And the reason why we have evidence for that is because we can do we have created things that look like they can think. And in the time that Kagan was writing, here's Kagan's book. In the time that Kagan was writing, it's the what is it? It's at least 10 years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago. It's sophisticated stuff, but in just the past year, the public has become aware of the advanced development of AI stuff, ChatGPT and all that, and that's starting to freak people out because ChatGPT can pretty much pass a famous test, which is by this very early genius of computer science, is Alan Turing. Look him up. The Turing test, he postulated you can tell when something can think if somebody interacting with it cannot tell if it's human or not. And I think we've reached that point pretty much. An engineer at Google, well, he wasn't an engineer, but an employee of Google whose job it was to interact with AIs over a year ago, long before ChatGPT was made available to the public, he was interacting with it. And he got so freaked out, he went to the press and said, it's gone sentient. AI has gone sentient. Google fired him and said, he's talking crazy. It can't think. It's just very complicated arrangement of sentences. But he had interacted with AIs at all stages in their development and got really freaked out by what he was observing. So clearly that's an indication that AIs can pass the Turing test. So, hey, if thinking is being able to form sentences in a way that makes us think we're talking to another human being, then, hey, physical objects can do that. Nobody is suggesting that ChatGPT has a soul. It's just complicated arrangements of electrons. Now, even if people say, and in the book, of course, he gives the example of a chess-playing computer, which, of course, existed back then. And we can talk about the chess-playing computer in terms that we would a human chess player. We can say, oh, it thinks this, it wants this, it's trying to get me to do that. We ascribe to it all of these mentalistic terms like thinking, believing, desiring, all these kind of things. And it makes sense to say that of the chess-playing computer because it helps explain its behavior. Just as we do with other people. We ascribe terms like think, believe, and so on to other people. And that's how we explain or predict their behavior too. So we're doing exactly the same thing to a computer as we do to a human. So the idea that it requires a soul seems unnecessary. In response, the usual response is, okay, sure. Computers can do an awful lot of things that we do. They can calculate. They can do things that certainly people in Descartes' time would have regarded as thinking. But they can't feel. They can't feel emotions yet. They can't feel emotions, and they can't have sensations. So, for example, if you feel anger or love, that's an emotion. But there's something at a lower level than that, which is the sensation of looking at the color blue, or smelling coffee, or feeling pain. These are sort of basic level chunks of awareness. There is a term that philosophers use for this, and it's qualia, Qualia, and it means basic kinds of sensation, like simple color sensation, just being aware of light, being aware of pain. Pain is a good one because it's so simple. It's so basic and raw, and even simple animals can feel pain, even if they can't experience complex emotions. That, we suggest, which is sort of bundled under the idea of consciousness, this first-person awareness that even a very young baby can have, we say AIs can't have it. Now, in response, there's two responses that Kagan makes. He says, first of all, just because we cannot explain how it could be possible for a computer to be conscious doesn't mean that it's impossible. He said, and he gives the example, if you'd said in 14th century that you don't need a soul to explain life, they wouldn't have believed you. They said, we can't imagine a soul, life without a soul. And he says, we're maybe at that stage of development. Sure, ChatGPT is pretty impressive, but, imagine in 100 years. Look at where we've got in 100 years. Imagine 100 years from now. Maybe we'll be perfectly okay with the idea that we can make a computer that's conscious. So that's the first response. How do you know that consciousness can't be explained physically, just because we haven't done it yet? And the second one is, all right, suppose I can't explain consciousness without, in physicalist terms. How are you explaining it in immaterial terms? How does the soul experience? You just say the soul is this magic thing that can have experiences. How? What's your explanation? You've got no better explanation than I've got. So why should I be forced to believe in your extra immaterial thing? Why should I populate my universe with extra material things just because you say it can explain it? You haven't done the job to show how souls can have consciousness. So you, the dualist, and me, the physicalist, are in the same boat, except that I don't believe in invisible stuff. So I'm still on better footing, he suggests. Personality. I added this one. It's not in the Kagan chapter, but certainly people do seem to think that that's another feature of humans that can only explain by soul. However, there's a lot of examples in the short excerpt from Bertha Alvarez-Maninen's piece that I gave you of how we now have very good evidence that personality is explained by your brain. And the most famous case of this is Phineas Gage from the 1800s. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, and his job was to blow up rocks that were in the way of laying the train tracks. So you drill holes in them, and you put gunpowder deep in it, and you tamp it down with a metal rod, and so it's right deep in the rock, and then you explode it, and that turns the rock into rubble. Well, he's doing this one day. The metal rod creates a spark on the side of the hole, ignites the gunpowder, and fires the metal rod right through his head. Right, goes in through the eye and goes through his brain and flies out the back. Didn't kill him, but it did destroy part of his brain. And what happened to him afterwards was that he underwent a complete personality change. Whereas before he was easygoing and happy and never got into quarrels, he became angry and argumentative and so on. And this was long after the pain subsided. So it wasn't just that he was irritable because he was in pain. And of course, Alzheimer's, we see similar things, and she goes into details of all the changes that people have got. People have become, a guy became a pedophile because of a brain tumor. People who work in care homes have described, it's not uncommon for lifelong, for example, heterosexuals to become gay at certain stages in Alzheimer's. So what that suggests is that your brain is responsible for all these features in your personality. And your brain, of course, is a physical object. It's not a soul, it's physical. So it looks like that actually the best explanation for your personality is physical. It's your brain. Free will. Now this is a good one. Back to Descartes again. Descartes believed firmly that the material universe, matter, is deterministic. Okay, what does determinism mean? Determinism means that a deterministic system is governed according to inflexible laws. So, for example, imagine a simple physical system like a billiard table with two balls on it. If you have a system like that and you set the ball rolling and you can detect exactly how fast it's going and exactly the direction it's going, you can predict, using math, exactly the state of that physical system at any point in the future, because you know all about momentum. You know about, if you understand the friction of the felt of the table, you can predict with perfect accuracy exactly where the balls will go. Or you can write a computer program to do it. Why? Why won't the balls just suddenly change direction? Because they don't. Because matter is governed by inflexible laws. And you know, these were the laws that were being discovered back when Descartes was writing. He was slightly before Newton, but Newton, of course, comes up with his famous laws of motion and so on. And they enable us to predict. Science has advanced so amazingly since the Renaissance because we have discovered the laws of the universe. We now know the rules that the universe goes by. But if the universe follows rules, and if a deterministic system is perfectly predictable, then everything we do is in theory perfectly predictable if we're just physical objects. So for example, if a computer could be built that was large enough that knew the position of every single particle in the universe and its direction it was going and so on, then in theory, that computer could predict the entire state of the universe at every point in its future. And as I'm just a part of the universe, it could predict exactly what I'm going to do and exactly what's going to happen to me at every point in the universe. In theory. And Descartes believed that that was possible for physical objects. If we're just physical objects, then it seems like we're puppets of the laws of nature. There's things, just as if I jump off a building, I have to fall because the law of gravity cannot be countermanded. So at every stage in my life, I have to do what I'm doing because the laws of nature are making me do that. That's the threat that determinism appears to have to free will, because then it looks like, the laws of nature said I would raise my arm, so there was no way I could have not raised my arm. Whereas normally we think of free will as having an option. I only do something freely if I could have not done that thing. But if determinism is true, I had to do that. There was no option. All right, that's a crash course. Again, whole books have been written about this. But the argument that free will is an argument for the existence of souls goes like this. We have free will, it is assumed. Nothing subject to determinism has free will. The billiard balls don't get to choose. All purely physical systems are deterministic. Anything just made of atoms and matter, and not souls, has to follow the laws of nature. So given that we have free will, we can't be purely physical systems. This is what's called a valid argument. These are premises, and this is the conclusion. If you believe these three, this has to be true. So if you don't believe this, if you're a physicalist and say, no, we are purely physical, then you have to say that one of these three is false. If you're committed to all of these three, then it looks like this is an argument that says we have to have souls. Now, he goes into, in the chapter, various ways of criticizing it. For example, there's a position called hard determinists who say we don't have free will. Sure, we think we do, but that's just because we're so incredibly complicated. We don't know the rule. We don't know the rules that we operate by. But you can predict the behavior of people you know pretty. If you know someone very well, you can predict their behavior pretty well in most circumstances. So that kind of suggests that we are deterministic, say the hard determinists. And hard determinists say we just got to get used to this idea that we're not really free. Now that has a whole lot of implications. And some of them aren't very pretty. For example, well, some of them, there would have to be huge prison reform, right? Because if you don't have free will, then murderers were just unfortunate. The laws of nature decided that they would murder. Nothing they could have done about it. That's just the laws of nature. It was decided before they were born. So it seems a bit unfair that we should punish them. Of course, in response, people sometimes say, well, I'm determined to punish them. But anyway. So there are people who reject this and therefore are not forced to conclude that we have souls. There are people that reject this. They say that you can have determinism and free will. That is a popular view in Britain. It has been argued by the great English philosopher John Locke, the great Scottish philosopher David Hume, the great English philosopher John Stuart Mill. I think Thomas Hobbes, another English philosopher, had a version of this. And it's actually quite popular in contemporary philosophy. So that is definitely not everybody accepts that. All purely physical systems are deterministic. Turns out they're not. Turns out, according to quantum mechanics, at a macroscopic level, it does look like things are very predictable, which is why we're so good at predicting the behavior of planets and so on, because they appear to be following the laws of physics. But it turns out at a subatomic level, it looks like they're not deterministic. They're called probabilistic laws. So you can question all three of these, so that argument isn't a knockdown argument for the existence of soul. And it has to be, because otherwise the burden of proof is on people arguing for souls, because they're arguing for something like magic. And if we can avoid believing in magic, we've got a scientific view, we've got a view that is consistent with science, and we've got a simpler view, a view that doesn't require believing these magical things. It's like if you had to choose between two explanations, one of which required you believing in invisible pixies, and one of which requires you not believing in invisible pixies, obviously this one is better, because you don't want to have to believe in invisible pixies unless you absolutely have to. Now, some people say dark matter is a bit like that. It's invisible. So people didn't believe in dark matter until they absolutely had to. There was no way to explain the phenomena that they were observing without it. But if there is a way to explain the phenomena without it, and physicalists think they've got one, then you don't have to believe in the invisible pixies. Finally, something that Kagan doesn't say is Descartes wanted to preserve human free will by saying, well, the universe is deterministic, but we have free will because we have souls that aren't deterministic. But there's something weird about saying this, because he also thinks that we're both, so he would say our bodies are caused to do what they do by the laws of the universe. So do I have any choice about raising my arm? No, because if the universe says my arm is going to go up, it's like the universe saying that an object is going to fall when I let go of it. I can't decide to have, I cannot decide to step off a building and not obey the law of gravity. I can't say, I choose to float here. So I cannot choose to violate the laws of the universe. So if the laws of the universe have determined that my arm is going up, it's going up. Now, according to Descartes, that doesn't affect my soul. So Descartes' picture would seem to have me thinking, okay, shall I raise my arm or not? I haven't decided yet. Oh, my arm's gone up. How did that happen? Oh, I guess that was the laws of the universe again. So according to Descartes' picture, my soul would be like an impotent captain in a ship that is automated, that just does what it's going to do anyway, and the captain just sits there saying, oh, I guess my arm went up. Oh, I guess I'm walking off this cliff now. I wish I wasn't, but there's nothing I can do about it. It doesn't make sense. And that's not our experience. Our experience is we think that our minds control our bodies. So what that suggests, if matter is deterministic, then our minds must also be deterministic because they're entirely in keeping with it. So that is a problem for Descartes' view. Descartes' view would have us like being ghosts in machines that have no effect on things that are just puppets of the law of nature. Finally, supernatural. I'm not going to really talk about this because I think Maninen does a good job of this. There are all these phenomena that people say, oh, this can only be explained with souls. The more we find out about the brains, we find out their experience. Like people have this strong sensation of someone in the room present with them, and they say that's a ghost or something like that. What they've discovered is there's a part of the brain that is responsible for your self-image, and it can be manipulated so that your self-image is actually slightly outside of your body, and you think that there's a presence, and it's actually you, because your mental self-image detector has been messed with. And they can do that. They can mess with and they can produce all the effects that people say, oh, I died on the operating table and I saw a bright light. That's a certain part of your brain being stimulated, as would happen at a stage when you're under great stress. So just about every supernatural phenomenon can be challenged. And seances and things like that have long been challenged by other magicians. There's a great guy called the Amazing Randi, R-A-N-D-I, who made it his job to debunk people like Uri Geller, who in the 70s was this famous guy who claimed to be a mentalist who could bend spoons with his mind. Randi showed how he did it. So look up the Amazing Randi. He made it his business to debunk all of these people, and they kind of hated him for it. But as yet, there is no supernatural evidence for which the best explanation is immaterial souls. There's always a just as good explanation that doesn't require you believing in the souls or invisible pixies. So, looks like there's no good reason to believe that we have souls.